Hello and welcome to my video on the rise of Egyptian culture. This is my first part of the world history series, and this video will take place from 30,000 BC to 3000 BC. So we're covering a long range of history here. So get ready. So in the beginning, I want to outline 3 objectives. So this is what the video will cover. The first objective is, how did civilization begin on the Nile? We're going to be looking at why the Nile was so conducive to human civilization. The second objective is, what did prehistoric Egyptian culture look like? And we're going to learn that there was not just one prehistoric Egyptian culture, there was actually many. We're going to see what made them different. The third objective is, how did prehistoric Egyptian culture evolve? So obviously we have such a long time range that the Egyptian culture did change throughout these years, and we're going to see how they changed, or how it changed. So to begin, I want to present some vocabulary that I'm going to be using in this video. So the first one is Neolithic. And when I use Neolithic, that's referring to the later part of the Stone Age, during which ground or polished stone weapons and implements were used. So think of like late cavemen that have started living in like huts, and even though the picture looks something like Europe, this didn't just occur in Europe, it occurred all over the world. So South and North America, Asia, Africa, even though they did differ in time period and stages. Second term I'm going to be using is nomadic pastoralism. So this is the practice by certain cultures of searching for pastures for their livestock to feed on, typically non-permanent settlements. So today we have some nomadic pastoral cultures, most famously the Bedouin in Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So we're going to be looking at how human civilization came into this form of living. The third one is Fertile Crescent. This is also called the cradle of civilization. It includes the fertile riverlands in the Middle East and North Africa, and it includes Egypt, Assyria, and Mesopotamia. A lot of historians focus on Mesopotamia as being kind of the first hub of civilization, but today we're going to be focusing on Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, as you can see in the picture. And the last term we're going to use is Seric. So a seric is a royal crest that was used in ancient Egypt, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about social stratification, which is very important. All right. To actually begin my presentation, my lecture on prehistoric Egyptian culture, I'd like to begin with the earliest Egyptian traces. So there's a typo in the first sentence. I apologize for that. So it should say 750,000 BC, like it says in the bottom left corner of the timeline. So around 750,000 BC, Egyptian stone tools existed in Egypt. This was known as the Paleolithic era, also known as the Old Stone Age. So stone tools were used to hunt, to build, to craft, that sort of stuff. This is pretty common in primitive cultures at the time. Terracing and flint tools are also used. So terracing can be used for agriculture. This is also found in other primitive cultures, and flint tools are used for hunting and just using basic tools for construction. And you can see on the right hand side of the page some tools. These were not found in Egypt, these were found in Europe, but they're still pertinent. They're pretty good examples. All right, so on to the late Paleolithic period. This was at about 30,000 BC, so we're still pretty far out from 3000 BC, which is the beginning of the actual Egyptian civilization proper. So between 100,000 BC and 30,000 BC, this was known as the late Paleolithic period, so we're moving on from the Old Stone Age. Housing structures known as tent rings appear and are used. And an interesting thing about tent rings is that they are semi-permanent. They can be taken down if needed. We're not entirely sure, but it seems like that they preferred for the tent rings to be permanent. But of course, Egypt has a very interesting environment, as we'll probably talk about later, and they can't count on animals coming into the same range constantly, or food being offered in the same area, so they would have to move quite often to follow their food, which we see in a lot of different cultures. And now we're seeing, during this time period, we're seeing Assyrian and Cormusan tool industries found at Wadi Halfa in Egypt. So when I talk about tool industries, I'm not talking about an industry like a factory. I'm talking about a grouping of tools that are quite similar and have like a similar cultural institution to them. So the two at this time were the Assyrian and Cormusan, and as you can see on the right hand image, that is an Assyrian spearhead or a bowhead. We're not quite sure what they are. I was reading online and it said that they found Assyrian, it looked like bowheads or spearheads, but they have never found the actual bow or spear. So it was used probably to hunt. So they're still hunting at this time period. Moving on to the Mesolithic period, which is kind of in the middle of the Stone Age, we see the rise of Halfin culture. And at this time period, we're at 8,000 to 15,000 BC. We're seeing more permanent settlement. The people are relying on fishing, large hunting, or large mammal hunting, and collecting with stone tools. As you can see on the right-hand corner, that's an example of pastoralism, which the Harifian culture practiced, as you can see in the bottom sentence of the slide. So they would have semi-domesticated or domesticated animals, such as the cattle you see there. Obviously, that picture is present-day Africa, or I'm not sure if it's Africa or India, but it looks like one of the two. And back then, in this time period in ancient Egypt, that was the common practice in the Harifian culture. And we're also seeing the Naqada and Sibyllian cultures around 13,000 BC. We're seeing the use of sickles for harvesting, so more of a reliance on agriculture. We're seeing non-organized agriculture, so we're not seeing farms yet or even like rows of crops. We're seeing just a sporadic use of crops. And another reason for this could have been the Sahara was beginning to dry. This was just like the beginning of the Sahara really turning into a desert, which forced migration towards the Nile River, which really led to the Egyptian civilization to form. So now we're at the Neolithic period, so we're at 4,000 BC. We're only about 1,000 years away from actual Egyptian culture or civilization. And the Sahara Desert expanded, so it got even more dry. And during this time period, we're seeing a lot of people become forced to migrate. So by 6,000 BC, migrants settled densely around the Nile. We're seeing large, so I use this term relatively, large for this time period, settlements or cities around the Nile, people grouping up. Weaving and cemeteries are practiced during this period. So weaving is a good example of a tangible culture that we can look at today. And cemeteries are interesting because this shows that there's more of a culture being used. People are like, the bodies are being respected and they're being buried outside of cities. Pottery also becomes important, and pottery is very important because it's something that's tangible. We can see it today and it can be preserved very well. And this pottery is called blacktopware. I'm probably going to talk about that later in this lecture. And we see a distinct break between Upper and Lower Egypt. And interestingly enough, there's Upper Egypt refers to southern Egypt, so closer to Sudan, it's more mountainous. And Lower Egypt refers to the north, where it's more rivers and plains and swamps. So we're seeing a larger difference in culture between the north and the south. And on the right, I include that image because, like I said, the Neolithic period was known for the Sahara expanding. I needed to bring up the Naqada cultures because a lot of classes typically ask about the Naqada cultures, why they're important. So Naqada cultures, don't think of them all as the same exact thing. They kind of built off of each other. That's why there's Naqada 1, 2, and 3. So Naqada 1 was about 4,000 to 3,500 BC. And it was known as the Amratian culture, or Naqada 1. And we're seeing blacktopware pots with crossed line designs and the introduction of mass-produced mud bricks. So this is important for two reasons. The cross-line design shows that there's more of a culture being used, that people aren't just producing pottery for just for the use. They're using it like they have like an aesthetic or a beauty standard for the crafts they're producing. And the mass-produced mud bricks, this is important because they're having not very permanent, but more permanent structures than what they used before. So they probably used like straw huts before. Now they're using mud brick, which is stronger. It can deal with the weather more, and it's just it lasts longer. So then in 3500 to 3200 BC, we're seeing the Gerzean culture, also known as Naqada II. This is the foundation for Egyptian culture. This is probably one of the most important cultural slots or slivers in Egyptian history. Pottery begins to feature ships and humans. This is very important because there's more of a humanistic sense in this culture, and we can see that the culture is really developing. Trade starts to become more widespread. Tombs are becoming more widespread, and the most important thing is a developed sense of agriculture. So now they're having permanent settlements, permanent farms. People can live in one spot, reproduce, and just continue to farm. And then eventually we get to Naqada 3 in 3200 to 3000 BC. This is known as Naqada 3, or the Protodynastic Period. This is considered the beginning of Egyptian culture or civilization proper. We're now having kings and more social stratification. And yes, now I'm going to talk about the Protodynastic Period a little bit. So the Protodynastic Period is also known as Naqada 3, like I said, and there was a major state unification. So political centers were created, but they weren't quite unified yet. Now we're seeing huge developments in Egyptian culture, such as writing, aka hieroglyphics, as most of you probably know, which are like the symbols used in Egyptian culture, and irrigation is also used for agriculture. And then serics, or royal crests, and royal cemeteries indicate social stratification. So there is a sense of status. There were the peasants, who were the lower classes, the craftsmen, who were the middle classes, and the kings and noblemen were the upper classes. Only the upper classes knew how to read and write. The kings typically didn't know how to, so that's why they had scribes. And yes, this was the stratification wasn't extreme. Don't think of it as you belong to one class and one class only. It was still developing because Egyptian culture wasn't, fully fleshed out yet. So to review, prehistoric Egypt evolved slowly but surely and laid the foundation for a unique North African culture. Forgot the N. Egypt is pretty culturally isolated due to its unique geography. It has deserts in almost all sides. It has mountains kind of protecting it in the south. It has the very, very harsh Sinai Peninsula to the east and the Libyan Desert to the west. So it was very isolated. And the Nile River allowed for a civilization to develop because it had a very consistent water source, which provided agriculture and food. The second main point was different cultures in prehistoric Egypt can be broken up into several subcultures, most famously the Naqada cultures. Like I said, the Naqada cultures are vital because they are so, they basically developed the foundation for Egyptian culture. And the third major point was by 3000 BC, Egypt was beginning to become unified by a strong central government. We're seeing a push to unify Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt, by one central king. So now I want to ask 3 questions for you to kind of think about why Egypt, just to reflect upon prehistoric Egypt. So the first one was, what was unique about Egypt's terrain that made it viable for human civilizations? I touched on that, but I want you to think more in depth. Think about rivers, think about deserts, think about the Mediterranean to the north. What else is going on in this time period? The second question is, why is the development of pottery, such as Naqada pottery, so important to archaeologists? Why might they be useful artifacts? I also touched upon this, but you can probably go more in depth about it. Why might pottery be something that is so prized by archaeologists in understanding this time period. And question number 3 is, how does social stratification affect a society? How do we know Egypt became socially stratified by 3000 BC? And we're going to talk a lot about stratification in future videos. So just because it's so important to Egyptian culture. So I'd like to end there. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned. Like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.